Well, we're now seeing Rudy Giuliani say, I'm doing everything with the consent and knowledge of the president. So this notion that we're all about looking into corruption in Ukraine, this was all about corruption. Well, where's the Department of Justice? Where's the State Department? Why is the president's personal attorney, quote unquote, looking into corruption? That's not, of course, what he's doing. And this notion, this assertion that we have maybe the sitting U.S. ambassador in Ukraine under some kind of physical and or electronic surveillance, and there's a quote-unquote insider willing to help us, needs to be investigated. If we were living in any kind of normal world, Nicole, we'd have the Secretary of State and the Attorney General of the United States ordering the FBI and the Diplomatic Security Service to investigate any assertion that someone inside the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine has compromised the security of the ambassador. And this guy, this congressional Connecticut candidate, Robert Hyde, he's going to go through some things. Let's put it that way. He needs to go through some things. Let's assume for a moment. He's already said, Nicole, this was done. It's a bunch of, I was drinking and talking with my buddies. Let's assume for the moment that he's a drunken moron, which appears to be the case. Let's assume that. That still means that it's okay to have a conversation about surveilling the ambassador, even if you're making it up. What kind of low have we sunk to today?
Well, let me follow up with you, Frank, because a former FBI official said to me today that under any normal circumstances, a special counsel would have been appointed today to investigate corruption at the State Department and the White House. It sort of makes you miss Jeff Sessions and even Matt Whitaker, who wasn't the sharpest tool ever to be displayed in the Department of Justice shed, but seemed to have some sense that permitting investigations that may have touched Donald Trump, like the ones in SDNY, to go forward. Is it your sense from any of your sources at the FBI that anything has been put into motion today based on these revelations? And the SDNY, they've already charged Lev Parnas, so federal investigators already knew this, right?
Actually, it's my sense that nothing has been put in place. That's my sense from who I'm speaking with, that there's nothing happening on this issue and the related issues. And let's be clear, when you develop a timeline of the communications involving Hyde and Parnas and Giuliani, you see meetings with Pompeo. You see phone calls to Pompeo. And so the question becomes even stronger. What role has our Secretary of State played in all of this? Did he have knowledge of security issues involving his ambassador in Ukraine? We need some answers regarding both the Attorney General and the Secretary of State, and we should see an immediate announcement of an investigation.
Joyce, Marie Yovanovitch's attorney, Lawrence Robbins, has called for an investigation to the apparent, actually, it's confessed surveillance. It's like Donald Trump confessing to the quid pro quo. This individual has confessed to surveilling and reporting back on said surveillance. So that's not in dispute. And this is a lawyer for Yovanovitch saying, quote, needless to say, the notion that American citizens and others were monitoring Ambassador Yovanovitch's movements for unknown purposes is disturbing. We trust that the appropriate authorities will conduct an investigation to determine what happened. Who are the appropriate authorities? I mean, Pompeo was on the phone when Trump asked Zelensky to investigate Biden. So who are the honest brokers left to call for any investigation like that?
Well, I think that's the problem. There aren't any honest brokers, and I agree with Frank. There doesn't appear to be any movement at justice. Secretary Pompeo should have been beaten the top of his desk demanding to find out why one of his people, why their security was compromised. His silence is one of the most defining and problematic features of this entire issue.
But isn't he guilty of more than silence? I mean, if he was complicit, he told Kurt Volker, he told the State Department officials on the ground in Ukraine to work with Rudy.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And that's all of the evidence here. And we know this because there was a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request. So this isn't information that the State Department or that the White House gave up voluntarily. A judge forced them to, and they turned it over on the last day they could, late at night. And that's how we learned that Mike Pompeo and Rudy Giuliani had a couple of phone calls on March 26th, set up through the White House. That's how the contact was made. And that's the same timeline where we've got Lev Parnas doing this texting, where he talks about, well, the ambassador, you know, we've got eyes on her. She's not getting out.
And Rick, Lev Parnas did more than text. He wrote handwritten notes like this one on hotel letterhead. Get Zelensky to announce that the Biden case will be investigated. That was obviously, I don't know if that's the quid or the pro or the quo, but I guess my question for you, Fiona Hill, in that dramatic final day of testimony, said, I realized when Gordon was testifying, Gordon Sondland, that there wasn't an irregular policy channel and a regular channel. There was just the channel. And the channel was about Lev Parnas's effort to, quote, get Zelensky to announce that the Biden case will be investigated. There's this, I think, falsehood out there that there was a mixing of official government business and Donald Trump's re-election efforts. There was no official U.S. government business. It was only Donald Trump's political efforts.
All of it was this corrupt second-tier channel on its own. All of this initiative was taken, as this letter proves, by Rudy and by Parnas and by all these people in this pyramid of skells and weirdos and mooks. All of these people that were involved in this, they're out of the State Department chain. All the claims that the State Department had anything to do with this are just flatly wrong. They were the ones trying to figure out where this outside influence is coming from. And I think that this new tranche of information is not the last thing we're going to see. I always describe the Trump situation as a fecal iceberg. There's always more badness under the water. You're always going to find more and more and more of these kind of things. And I think that this evidence that's come out today, it points a lot of things directly. I mean, one of the people listed in the Parnas notes is a guy named Brian Ballard. He's Trump's favorite lobbyist. And you and I both know Brian from our Florida days. And Brian Ballard's employee, Pam Bondi, who works for Ballard, who is a Ballard Partners employee, is now in the White House running the impeachment defense. So this is one of these, the Parnas things are like a Rosetta Stone to this entire affair, and we're going to find more and more. If I were these people, I would not have any fear, though, because what's going to happen? The only people who should be afraid are American diplomats who cross Trump politically, because Mike Pompeo will hang them out to dry and die. Bill Barr will never lift a finger to pursue justice if it gets in the way of Donald Trump's political future. It's a really sick situation.
Garrett Haake, Frank Figliuzzi is the second former FBI official to say to me today that it's his suspicion that nothing is happening at the Justice Department in terms of investigating this really frightening surveillance of an American ambassador by private American citizens working at the president's direction through Rudy Giuliani. If this all falls to congressional investigators and if this moves to the Senate, what can they do?
Well, they're going to have their hands tied. I mean, if you think about it, the Senate will be able to do nothing but impeachment starting about this time tomorrow afternoon until that process is over. And the group you'd think might be most likely to take this up would be the House Intelligence Committee led by Adam Schiff, who's also going to be extremely busy with impeachment going forward. But it's possible that the efforts to get to the bottom of this and maybe retroactively protect folks like Yovanovitch may dovetail with impeachment. I was struck today by Adam Schiff in the press conference with Nancy Pelosi. We've talked so much in the last 2 weeks or so about the importance of getting the John Bolton testimony. That's not what Schiff talked about. He said the important thing is to get documents, that the documents cannot lie to you. And I think the Parnas trove here proves that. Everything from Rudy Giuliani's letter to Zelensky on Rudy Giuliani letterhead, which is extraordinary, to everything else that's been laid out here about Yovanovitch. And so to the degree that the whole country is going to be forced to pay attention to impeachment over the next 2 weeks in a really significant way that I don't think people have gotten their heads around yet, you might back into learning more about this specific effort and putting more pressure on the administration, justice, state, and so on to address this specific new information directly. Just because of the sheer weight of impeachment going to sit on the entire country over the next couple of weeks.
Let me just push back gently and with respect and say their hands are tied. Aren't they tied with this? Isn't this central to what he's impeached for? Abusing his office to try to benefit and influence the 2020 election? And if you get John Bolton, isn't the first thing you ask him, hey, you called this a drug deal, which suggests you knew something illegal was going on. Did you know they were surveilling Yovanovitch? I mean, isn't this central to what their hands are tied by?
Oh, absolutely. I'm only making the point that in the process of prosecuting this, you're going to have the addition, not discovery in a pure legal sense, but you're going to find out more about this as you go along. And I think the point that Schiff was making is that, I'd rather get an email from John Bolton to somebody saying, what the hell is this guy up to, than to try to nail down a testimony from John Bolton and fight that legal battle, right? I mean, just as an example, that the documentary evidence has been so powerful at every step of this trial. I mean, think about the very first piece of impeachment evidence that I think captured the national attention. It was the Bill Taylor text messages saying we would be crazy to trade political favors for, for information here, or whatever the exact text of the text message.
It's a perfect point, because that was from Kurt Volker, who was the first witness to participate in a closed-door deposition, and the first and maybe one of the only people to turn over all of his documents. So I want to stay with you one more beat here, Garrett. A source close to Bolton told me today, flip open one of his books. He's written numerous, and look at the footnotes. And you want to know what kind of documents John Bolton's in possession of? He's someone who takes Bill Taylor style notes and documents. And so you're right. The prospect of Bolton testimony isn't just the drama of someone sitting there being asked, what did you mean when you told Fiona Hill you didn't want to be part of the drug deal that Rudy and Sondland were cooking up, but the troves of notes that he must have taken about what he saw that concerned him so much. He sent not one, not two, but at least 3 of his deputies upstairs where the lawyers sit. Let me play Donald Trump admitting to knowledge of the kinds of things Marie Yovanovitch would go through, because it seems like we got another confession from the president on our hands.
She said bad things about me. She wouldn't defend me, and I have the right to change an ambassador. And Rudy didn't say good things, but he wasn't crazy about it. This was not an angel, this woman, okay? And there are a lot of things that she did that I didn't like, and we will talk about that at some time.
Okay.
But I just want to let you know, this was not a baby that we're dealing with.
I mean, the president could have asked for her to resign at any moment, and he didn't. What instead happened, as we can now see very clearly, the president sent his personal lawyer to Ukraine, where the personal lawyer then oversaw a gang of plumbers who had an American ambassador potentially under surveillance and perhaps in danger. That is totally astonishing. It is beyond
say that
any
again,
pale.
because that's exactly what happened. And I'm not sure, I saw this break last night, I'm not sure people have put it that way.
I mean, it's gotten very complex, but it's very simple. He sent his lawyer to Ukraine. That guy organized a bunch of people there to put the American ambassador, his own ambassador, under surveillance and possibly put her in danger. I wouldn't take all this information, all these notes at face value. The line between dark arts and Keystone Cops is pretty thin here. But if it's true, it's mind-numbing, and it puts a lot of wind in the sails for the Senate right now to consider this.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.